My topic today, Iran and the Arabs, is about the changing balance of power that has taken place between Iran and the Arabs over the last 20 years or so. This is, I would say, a rather exceptional development in the Middle East. If you think about it, for a very long time, we all used to talk about the Middle East and the Arab world as if they were one and the same thing. And the Middle East and the Arab world were coterminous in the sense that the non-Arab players in the Middle East were more or less ignored. Turkey, Iran. Israel was not ignored because there was the Arab-Israeli conflict that everybody was engrossed in. But if you look at the Middle East today, the three main actors in the Middle East today are not Arab states. One is Turkey, the second one is Iran, and the third is Israel. If you think about it, there is not one single Arab state, not one, which is a major mover and shaker of regional events. People often ask me, what about Saudi Arabia? Well, what about Saudi Arabia? There's nothing much that the Saudis can change in terms of what is going on in the region. And as Iranian influence increases, so the Saudis become ever more anxious, but there's nothing much they can really do about it. And probably in their heart of hearts, they hope that Israel will do what the Saudis would like to have done to the Iranians. In 1994, King Abdullah of Jordan spoke about what he called the Shiite Crescent. Excuse me, not 1994, 2004. After the American invasion of Iraq, and I will come back to that, Iranian influence grew considerably after the fall of Saddam Hussein and essentially the takeover by the Shiites of Iraq. So you had what he called, what King Abdullah called, the Shiite Crescent. That is Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and to Hezbollah in Lebanon, this arc of Iranian influence from Iran to the Mediterranean, something that had not existed at any time in the modern era in the Middle East. A few months ago, an Arab observer in the Gulf said that the term Shiite Crescent is out of date. It's not a Shiite Crescent anymore, it's a full moon. We are surrounded. What he meant by that was the inclusion of Yemen in Iran's sphere of influence. There is a civil war going on in Yemen between Shiites and Sunnis, and the Iranians are pretty much in the camp of the Shiites, who have now taken over considerable elements of Yemen, and therefore giving Iran an unprecedented control, or at least influence, over two major points of strategic importance in the region. The Strait of Hormuz, which is the exit from the Persian Gulf, and Bab el-Mandab, which is the entrance to the Red Sea. And that is why Sunnis in the Arab world will now say it's no longer the Shiite Crescent, it's a full moon. We are surrounded. The sense of Iranian preponderance. But having said that, the power of Iran is very much a story of Arab weakness than it is of inherent Iranian strength. It is much more about the crisis of the Arabs than it is about inherent Iranian power. There is a tendency, and I will expand on that a little later, to exaggerate Iran's great power, because Iran's power is seen against the background of Arab weakness. No, people sometimes say, I'm not a great fan of this statement, that when looking at Iran and Israel and the nuclear issue, that we are in 1938 and Iran is Nazi Germany. Well, we're not in 1938, and Iran is nowhere near Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was the greatest military power of its time. Iran is nowhere near that. We're not in 1938. Iran is not Nazi Germany, and it's not the Soviet Union either. Iran has an economy the size of Massachusetts. just for your information. And it has a military budget 1/100th of the size of the United States, 1/3 of Israel's. So Iran, as I say, should be seen much more as a rising force in the region, but very much to do with the weakness of the Arabs. The Arabs, who are between revolution, civil war, refugees and migration. You see what's going on in Europe now, the migration problem, which is partly to do with the civil war in Syria, but not entirely. A lot of the migration to Europe, which will probably increase, I would guess, would continue even if the civil war in Syria were to end. The Arab world is in serious crisis, and we've seen this politically from the early 1960s. There was this great peak of pan-Arabism when Syria and Egypt united in what was called the United Arab Republic in 1958. Well, the United Arab Republic broke up in 1961. For those here, there will be some who will remember that in 1962, a civil war began in Yemen, which sucked the Egyptians into Yemen, which became Egypt's Vietnam. And one of the reasons why the Egyptians were so resoundingly defeated by the Israelis in 1967. The defeat in 1967 was the ultimate humiliation of the idea of Arab unity and pan-Arabism as presented then by Egypt and Abdel Nasser. And I would argue that from 1967, the Arabs haven't really recovered until this day. I would say in parenthesis that Israel hasn't recovered from the victory either. But the Arabs haven't recovered from the defeat, which is more to our subject of today. The Arab world cannot sustain its population. And the numbers are quite striking. In the year 2000, the population of the Arab world was 280 million. All the Arab states, that is from Morocco in the west to the Gulf. The population of the Arab countries, 280 million in the year 2000. We're now in 2015 and the number is 370 million. In 2025 it'll be 450 million. Who is going to feed these people? Who is going to create jobs for these people? They have to emigrate, and they will. Therefore, what you see now, I would argue, is just the beginning. Motivated primarily by the horror of the civil war in Syria. But in terms of the economies of these states, this is probably not going to improve anytime soon. Europe has a population deficit. The Arab countries have a population surplus. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize how these economic forces of supply and demand are going to work, irrespective of what happens within Syria. In 1938, that is more than 70 years ago, two Egyptians wrote two very important books about the Egyptian economy. And what these two Egyptians said in 1938, that we are heading for a population explosion, and if we don't modernize our economy, we will end up in socio-economic crisis of huge proportions. Well, they were right. Nothing much was done about it, and what they predicted is exactly what happened. So you have massive urbanization and its attendant political and socio-economic problems, which one can call very briefly the crisis of modernization. Now, Iran and Turkey have also experienced massive urbanization, just like the Arabs have. And they have also experienced political instability, repeated interventions by the military in Turkey, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. So even though Turkey and Iran have also gone through revolutionary or semi-revolutionary transitions, they have done much better than the Arabs have. And I would argue that the main reason for them having done better than the Arabs is the Turkish and Iranian centuries-long tradition of sovereignty and statehood. They are not new states. They have been around for centuries. Turkey is the evolution of the Ottoman Empire, but the Turks are not new to the game of governance. They also have populations that are, relatively speaking, more cohesive than those of the Arab countries. Iran, for example, has various ethnic groups in Iran, but the huge majority of Iranians, close to 100%, are Shiite Muslims. And Turks are Sunnis. This crisis of the Arabs and the failure of Pan-Arabism is also the crisis and failure of secular politics. Arab nationalism is secular politics. Arab nationalism was an effort to define people who spoke the Arabic language as a people, irrespective of whether they were Muslims or Christians. Arab nationalism was a secularizing device. And therefore the failure of Arab nationalism, the failure of Pan-Arabism, was also the failure of this secularizing westernization. The attempt to define people by the language they spoke like Europeans did. You were German because you spoke German and you lived in a country called Germany. So the idea was that the Arabs were a people. They spoke Arabic, and all people who spoke Arabic were part of the Arab nation. But the failure of Arabism, therefore, is also the failure of this secularizing platform and the rise of the challenge of political Islam within states and between states. Today, if you look at the Middle East, countries ally with one another on the basis of their religious denomination. The Shiites versus the Sunnis. It's not the Republicans versus the monarchists, or the pro-Soviet versus the pro-American as it once was. Just as an aside, I mentioned the civil war in Yemen in 1962. Well, in the civil war in Yemen in 1962, Iran and Saudi Arabia were on the same side, because it was the progressives, the Republicans versus the monarchists, and Iran and Saudi Arabia were both monarchies. The fact that they were Sunnis and Shiites and Arabs and Persians made no difference. That wouldn't be the case today, hardly. Pan-Arabism sought to unite the speakers of the Arabic language. It had a unifying impact. Political Islam does exactly the opposite. Political Islam emphasizes the differences between the different peoples who speak Arabic. It's about Sunnis and Shiis and the various minorities, about religious denominations. Political Islam has the reverse effect of the unifying impulse of Pan-Arabism. This is destructive to the unification and the cohesion of Arab states. So the 21st century is dramatically different to what we knew in the 20th century. The 20th century was the century of Arabism, Pan-Arabism, and the creation of the Arab state. The 21st century, at least from the initial phase, is beginning to look like the end of Pan-Arabism, which ended a long time ago, but also the dismantling of the Arab state, if ISIS is anything to learn from. And something critically important about the Middle East has to be said in this framework. Culture matters. There are some who would like to argue that culture doesn't matter. But I really do not think that one can understand the workings of the Middle East, those that I'm talking about today too, without recognizing that culture matters. Culture matters, that is, in the Middle East, religion matters. And people's religious beliefs and their religious denominations matter hugely, differently to what we may be accustomed to in the West. and one should be willing and accommodating to recognize the difference. Daniel Lerner, an American social scientist in the 1950s, wrote what became a rather canonical book about the Middle East. And Lerner's book was called The Passing of Traditional Society, Modernizing the Middle East. The problem is that traditional society did not pass. There was no passing of traditional society. That was an assumption that sociologists made in the 50s and the 60s. But traditional society did not pass. There is this very famous book, which I'm sure everyone here has heard of at least, Benedict Anderson's very famous Imagined Communities. So Benedict Anderson talks about Europe in the 18th century. And Benedict Anderson says of Europe in the 18th century that nationalism succeeded religious modes of thought. Well, in the Middle East, it didn't. Nationalism never succeeded religious modes of thought. It competed with them. They lived together. They coexisted and competed with each other. But nationalism never succeeded religious modes of thought, never pushed them to the sidelines, the way this was done in Europe. The trinity of modern social science, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, all spoke of the declining importance of religion in modern society. Well, that may be true in some places, not in the Middle East. And when I say the Middle East, one should also say, not in exactly the same way, but in Israel also. The assumption made by the Zionists that religion was on the way out and Zionism would succeed it, Benedict Anderson style, nationalism replacing religious modes of thought, well, the Zionists have something to think about too. Didn't work the way they thought. But what are the explanations for this resilience of tradition? And I would say in Middle Eastern societies we're talking about four factors. Religion was never separated from the state. There never was a clean break. Never happened in the Ottoman Empire, and never happened in the independent Arab states either, in any complete fashion. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Middle Eastern societies are not societies of individuals, but societies composed of groups. People belong to groups. Families, extended families, religious sects, and tribes. And the association with your group overrides your individuality, which is not typical of Western societies. The United States invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein with the expectation that the individuals of Iraq would organize in political parties and create a democratic society. But the groups of Iraq went to war with each other. Because it was much more important for the people of Iraq to be associated with the groups to which they have belonged for centuries upon centuries than behaving as individuals. And I'm not saying one is better or worse, and one is not preferable to the other. They are just different. And what I very often find here in the West, what I find a kind of surprising contradiction where societies define themselves as multicultural. And they are multicultural societies, and I think being multicultural societies is eminently worthy, and there's nothing to say against it at all. But the same multicultural societies who regard themselves as multicultural do not recognize that other cultures are indeed other. They're different. Why do you expect the Iraqis to behave like you? And the multiculturalism, rather than recognizing that others are indeed other, it is a kind of sanctimonious view of permitting others to be like you. Well, that's not the real thing. The real thing is recognizing the otherness of the other and allowing them to be other. They don't have to be like you, and don't expect them to either. Not very likely that they will do so. Secular societies were not established despite more than 2 centuries of reform, Western-style reform, in Middle Eastern countries, primarily because these Western-style reforms were imposed top-down. The reforms were imposed by reforming governments, by the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire, and then by leaders like Abdul Nasser. They didn't come from popular request. And very often the secularizing reforms that were imposed top-down were rejected by the people at the bottom. And of course, there is the radical Islamist opposition to these westernizing, secularizing trends. Now, this leads right into Iran and the Arabs. Sunni radicalism and Shiite radicalism are not the same. So you see amongst the Sunnis, the Arabs for the most part are Sunnis, a difference in doctrine in comparison to what Shiite radicalism focuses on. And the differences in doctrine have political ramifications. The Sunnis highlight the principle of the rule of Islamic law. Societies to be Islamic must be ruled by the Sharia. So the guiding principle of Islamic radicalism, Sunni style, is the imposition of the Sharia. If societies are not governed by the Sharia, they cannot be Islamic. Just like Jewish fundamentalists in Israel would argue that Israel cannot be Jewish if it's not governed by the halakha, which is the Jewish equivalent to the Sharia. By the way, halakha and Sharia mean exactly the same thing. The way you go, it's the term means exactly the same. The Shiites, not that they don't value the implementation of the Sharia, but the guiding principle of Shiite Islamic radicalism is the nature of the leader, the rule of the jurisprudent. It is about the nature of the ruler. It is his responsibility to see to it that Islamic law is implemented. But the struggle is about the nature of the ruler. What is the end result of these differences of doctrine? In the Sunni world, there is no authority who will decide and give an opinion of what is the right way to go about implementing the Sharia. There are hundreds and thousands of different versions. There is no unity of institution that has the authority to decide on these matters of religious law. Whereas in the Shiite world, once the Ayatollahs of Iran have taken over, there is a central authority to which Shiis around the Middle East submit to and accept. Shiite radicalism is unifying. Sunni radicalism is divisive. The advantages, therefore, in the field of doctrine play for Iran. As the Sunnis disintegrate, the Shiites collaborate. So the Sunni camp is multipolar and sometimes looks like the Hobbesian war of all against all. ISIS is against Syria and against Iraq, because Syria and Iraq are not ruled by Sunnis. Syria is ruled by a small minority, the Alawis, who are actually a breakaway from Shia and are not really Muslims, if one wants to be strict about it. And Iraq is under Shiite domination. ISIS is also against the Sunni regimes of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The publics in these countries, the public in Jordan and the public in Saudi Arabia, is not necessarily anti-ISIS. And very many people in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia argue, why should we be fighting against ISIS? ISIS are Sunnis like we are. They're fighting the Shiites who are threatening us. Why should we fight ISIS? And amongst the Sunnis, you have the Muslim Brethren. You have Salafis who are jihadi. You have Salafis who are not jihadi. You have Al-Qaeda. You have Jabhat al-Nusra and another 100 organizations. Sometimes fighting together, sometimes fighting against each other. When the Saudis and their allies attack the Shiites in Yemen, they are actually doing ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are the Saudis' enemies, they're doing them a favor. If you attack the Shiites in Yemen, who are the enemies of Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brethren, then you are, the Saudis are fighting against the enemies of their enemies and doing them a favor. The Saudis at times support the Muslim Brethren, at times they're against them. Depends on the circumstances. It's all very fluid. So political Islam on the Sunni side exacerbates the differences and contributes to the disintegration of the state in places like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon long before. All the Sunni factions who are opposed to each other are also opposed to the various minorities, Christians and other minorities who are not Sunni Muslim. So these minorities seek their own protection within the framework of their own separate sectarian identity. Their sectarian identity is also reinforced by the threat from the Sunni radicals. So Copts in Egypt become more religiously associated with their Coptic identity, as do other Christians in the Middle East, as do the Alawis in Syria, who are now fighting for their lives. Assad and his community are only 11-12% of Syria. They are fighting for their lives. They will be hanging from the lampposts if they lose. And the Shiites, threatened by the Sunnis, who seek Iranian support to maintain Shiite, at least equality with the Sunnis, if not supremacy. And as for the Christians, in huge numbers, they're simply leaving the Middle East. They cannot remain in these circumstances. The vacuum created by this internal division was only enhanced by the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. There is one word which perhaps epitomizes more than any other the misconception of the United States vis-à-vis Iraq. And that word is called de-Baathification. What is de-Baathification? De-Baathification is taken from Germany in the Second World War, denazification. When the Americans had defeated the Germans, they engaged in the denazification of Germany. Iraq, in their mind, was having been defeated just like Germany was. They will now engage in de-Baathification. But the Baath is not the Nazi party. The Baath is the party, the machinery, the political machinery, whereby the Sunni minority of Iraq ruled Iraq. That is how Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq. He had this oppressive Baathi party, which was the machinery whereby the Sunnis kept the Shiites in their place. You de-Baathify Iraq, you're kicking out the Sunnis. And you are empowering the Shiites, who are the majority in Iraq. So maybe it's fair to have the Shiite majority in power in Iraq. Maybe it's more just. But what it also means is handing over Iraq to Iran. The Shiites of Iraq are the co-religionists of Iran. That is giving Iran a platform in the heart of the Arab world that they never had before. The de-Baathification of Iraq is essentially the destruction of the gatekeeper of the Arab East. Iraq was the gatekeeper of the Arab East. The Iraqis, the Sunni Arab Iraqis, kept the Iranians out. Once you demolish their regime, you may have done something very just. Saddam was a bad guy. But that is what creates the Shiite crescent. You open the door to the Shiite Crescent and more. Now, Shiite radicalism, because of its focusing on the rule of the jurisprudent and the nature of the government, you have a central religious authority, which is the inspiration and pretty much the political authority for Shiites throughout the Middle East. Shiites in Lebanon, the Shiites in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen will all bow to Iran and take their instructions or assistance and guidance from Iran. They are the effective proxies serving Iranian hegemonic design. And there is no similar leader or authority on the Sunni side. The Saudis would like to be, but that's just in their imagination. They couldn't possibly be. They just don't have the power to be. I mean, look at the Saudis fighting in Yemen now. They've been at it for 6 or 7 months. The Houthis are still hanging in there pretty well. Saudi Arabia simply does not have the power. There are other Sunni players who have the power, but not the desire. Turkey, for example, don't want to take on the Iranians. They never did. When the Ottoman Empire was the Ottoman Empire, Iran was not enemy number one by any means. The enemies of the Ottoman Empire were all in Europe, the Russians in particular. The Turks are not looking for a fight with Iran. You will hear very little from the Turks about Iranian nuclear aspirations and any other complaint about Iranian regional designs. Egypt is a powerful country, has a huge army, but the Egyptians have their own problems. The Egyptians are completely consumed by their own domestic problems, keeping Egypt economically afloat, fighting their own ISIS representation in the Sinai Peninsula. So the Egyptians are not there to try and push back the Iranians. They have no great enthusiasm for Iran, but they don't have much enthusiasm to lead the fight against it either. The Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians are not particularly interested in resorting to force against Iran. But Iran has no hesitation to use force, subversion, spending huge amounts of money, of which they will now have much more, on their various Shiite proxies in the region. But to round off the analysis, the Iranians have their problems too. Iran is a regional power. But in international terms, going back to what I mentioned before, it is a minor power. Having to deal for a long time with the damaging effect of low oil prices and the sanctions on Iran, but especially the war in Syria. The war in Syria is not going well for the Iranians. Assad is their client, and Assad is having a very hard time. The rebels in Syria are coming ever closer to the heartland of the Alawi minority. The Alawi minority are concentrated, if you look at Syria, the west coast of Syria is a mountainous area known as the Alawi region. The Alawis predominate in that mountainous area. And it is the heartland of, let's say, the Alawi territory. The rebels, as they move from Aleppo towards the coast, are coming ever closer to what is left of the Alawi territorial haven. If you read in the last few days, the Russians are flying in to exactly that area. They're landing at the airport in Latakia. You can't see Latakia, it's not on the map here, but it's the coastal city of northern Syria. So the Russians seem to be, as the Iranians, recognizing the difficulty of their client, Assad, but to the credit of the Russians and to the credit of the Iranians, they stand up and fight for their clients, as opposed to some others. There are increasing defections from the ruling elite in Syria, an indication of how tough things are. The regime has serious problems of morale and manpower. Young men from the Alawi community are evading conscription. They have had huge losses. They don't want to fight. So there is ever-increasing dependence of Assad and the regime in Syria on Iran and on Hezbollah, that is the Shiite militia from Lebanon, to fight for them. And the Iranians are sending their own men and militiamen from Iraq and Hezbollah from Lebanon to fight on Assad's behalf. Without them, Assad might have already fallen. In Iraq, the Shiites are the majority. They're 60% of the people. It's easy for Iran to support the Shiites of Iraq effectively because they are the majority population in Iraq. The Alawis in Syria, 11-12% of the population, are a small minority. It's very hard for the Iranians to prop them up all the time without channeling their own men to fight for Assad. But the Iranians are determined, even though the cost is high. There are some who have said that the Iranians are funding the Syrians to the tune of $1 billion a month to keep the regime going. That is Iran before the lifting of the sanctions. That is Iran when oil prices are low. The Iranians don't have that much. Yet they are willing to invest so much to keep the Syrians in place. So one has to take one's hat off to the Iranians, at least, that they put their money where their mouths are, and they stand up and fight for those who they think are on their side. And they do so because if Syria is lost, Iran's strategic hegemonic design will be severely set back, and I would argue not only severely but perhaps irreparably set back. Without Syria, Iran has no direct connection to Hezbollah, no direct connection to Lebanon, and you have a situation where Iran loses its stranglehold on Israel. Iran, with a presence in Syria, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, sits on Israel's jugular. From Lebanon and from Syria, the border with the Golan Heights and the Galilee, the northern part of Israel, the Iranians can bring down on Israel tens of thousands of rockets at any time of their choosing to deter Israel from attacking Iran or to take revenge on Israel for attacking Iran. But their presence in Syria is what governs their presence in Lebanon. And without both of these, the Iranians lose strategically very heavily. Therefore, the importance of their maintenance of their place in Syria. So Lebanon and Syria are these two critical theaters for the balance of power between Iran and Israel. And lastly, the role of the US in all of this. First of all, a general observation. There is a tendency to exaggerate, to greatly exaggerate, the influence of the great powers in the Middle East. There was a time when the great powers had great influence in the region, but that is no longer the case. The great powers cannot get their clients in the Middle East to do exactly what they would like them to do. One American diplomat expert called this Gulliver's problems. Gulliver can't get the midgets of Lilliput to do whatever he would like them to do. The US in Iraq would seem to contradict what I've just said. After what the US did in Iraq had great influence. But that's not what the Americans intended. What the Americans intended in Iraq was something altogether different. What happened in Iraq actually exposes the fact that the Americans cannot do what they wish to do. What they wanted to do in Iraq was something altogether different. And what happened in Iraq is the local powers telling the US how it really works. Local powers, local trends, local political culture. Don't ignore it. And President Obama is not that much different from former American presidents in coming to terms with what happens in the Middle East. That is, the United States does not shape what happens in the Middle East. It tends much more, if you look at the historical record, to come to terms with what the locals are doing in the Middle East. The master mover and shaker of the Arab world in the 1950s and 1960s, when Egypt was this great country, was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was the greatest Arab leader, I think, of the 20th century. And the Eisenhower administration, and thereafter the Kennedy administration, both tried to come to terms with Abdel Nasser. They didn't make an agreement with him. They failed to come to an agreement with him, but not for the lack of trying. And I think if I understand correctly what the present US administration is doing, is coming to terms with Iranian hegemony. That is, looking at the weakness of the Arabs, Iran is part of the solution, not the problem. That is, as opposed to the Saudis and the Israelis, the US allies, they see Iran as the core of the problem, whereas the administration seems to be ever more seeing Iran as potentially part of the solution. And without going into too much detail, but looking at this as an outsider, the US is often locked in the contradiction between values and interests. Who do you support? Do you go with where your interests are, or do you go where your values are? So one day they are in favor of the military regime in Egypt because they serve American interests, and on another day they don't like the military regime in Egypt because it's a military regime, and because it overthrew the democratically elected Muslim brethren who are enemies of the United States. So there's a lot of inconsistency here. Do you go with the Democrats, who may be opposed to your interests? Do you go with those who are instigators of military coups, who may serve your interests? There is a lot of coming and toing and froing there, and no great consistency. One way, one day this way, and another day another way. Assad was called to step down. The Americans said Assad must step down. But then fighting against ISIS, they're fighting for Assad. Every ISIS man you kill is doing Assad a favor. So if the Americans bomb ISIS, which is perhaps what they should do, at the same time they're doing the Syrian regime a favor because they're hurting the enemies of the regime. So it's all very inconsistent. And here, just in conclusion, so what does the nuclear agreement do with all of this? The nuclear agreement came at a time when Iran was hurting. Hurting from the sanctions, hurting from low oil prices, and hurting from the losses in Syria. The Iranians needed this agreement rather desperately. In general, the scales had been tipping in favor of the Iranians long before the agreement. Recent difficulties notwithstanding, the trend over the years has been in Iran's favor. The agreement, however, has tipped the scales even further in Iran's favor. The windfall of sanctions relief, the $100 to $150 billion that will go Iran's way, will obviously serve its regional ambitions and not impede them. The nuclear program is contained but not abolished, which is what the Israelis or the Saudis or others would have wanted. There is one thing that the Iranians and their regional rivals agree upon fully. That is, things recently have gone in Iran's favor. Thank you.